I ran out of music a few seconds early. I try not to do that. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you on a Tuesday evening. Got a wonderful daf for you today. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Tuesday night? Steven in New Hampshire, Pauline in Chicagoland, Nancy in North Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Bill in Missouri, Randy in Florida, Bella in Florida, Judith in Arizona, Sharon in New Jersey, Paula in Chicago, Paula loves the music, John Pittman in Maine. That was Eitan Katz, part 2 of his song, Ki Malachav, there on Unplugged 3, the songs of Shlomo Carlebach. Welcome, Aoife on the YouTube side, checking in from Florida. It's really great to be with you. It's been, emotionally trying, this whole chapter 3 here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. And today we're coming to the end of chapter 3. And we're finally getting a little bit of a different subject. This whole chapter, so the tractate is about the laws of marital contracts. Since a virgin receives a different minimum amount in the marriage contract than a non-virgin, what if she was rendered a non-virgin against her will? She was raped. Or what if she was seduced? The Torah provides that a young woman, meaning not a minor and not an adult woman, so still under the authority of her father, if she's raped or seduced, in addition to other damages and punishments which may accrue, the rapist or the seducer pays a fine, and that's different than damages because he has rendered her not a virgin and sort of changed her value in the marriage marketplace, as it were. So we've been looking at the ins and outs of these laws, and while we've been talking about very specific, nuanced laws of the fine versus damages, etc., it's just very hard to talk about these topics when we're mindful that, well, why did this topic come up? Because a woman was raped and underwent such a trauma. But as I've reminded us over and over again, we're not examining the criminal law aspects of these provisions. We're really looking at that specific question of how it affects the marriage contract and what is the nature of the fine as distinguished from the damages. And in these last few pages, we've finally been getting at what the damages portion are of the consequences of this violent act. We pick this up on page 41. This is our daf today, Mem Aleph, page 41, the final page of chapter 3, here in Tractate Kesubos. Today, we're doing Mishnah number 8. So we start with a new Mishnah for the day. And this gets into some very interesting questions. So, Mishnah number 8, one who says, I seduced the daughter of so-and-so. So he comes and admits, there's a principle among criminal lawyers, right? First rat to the courthouse wins. What they mean by that is where there was a conspiracy, the one who rats out his fellow conspirators and works with the cops, works with the feds, he's going to get a much sweeter deal, reduced prison time or maybe no prison time because he rats on his friends. The flip side of turning yourself in to the law, as it were, where there is no necessarily a conspiracy, there's no accomplices, but the sages and the Torah itself rewards one who admits his crime without having to admit it, right? So like if he confesses that he did something wrong before witnesses come forward and make the accusation, he's actually rewarded for that, as we shall see. So one who says, I seduced the daughter of so-and-so, pays compensation for humiliation and degradation based on his own admission, but he does not pay the fine, right? So the fine in the Torah said, one who seduces a young woman pays this fine of 50 sela, which is equal to 200 dinar, which is sort of the dowry amount of a virgin entering marriage. Since he's rendered her not a virgin, he has to pay that amount of money as a fine, separate from humiliation, degradation, etc., which we were talking about yesterday and the day before. So here, but if he comes forward and makes this confession, he's still liable for the humiliation and degradation that he caused to his victim. And what's interesting here is, even in ancient times, right, and in the Torah, why is the seducer sort of liable to pay these damages? If you think about that for a second, what does a seducer mean? It means, he made the offer and she accepted. He wanted to sleep with her and she was not raped. She participated in this act of extramarital or premarital sex. So why does he owe the fine for rendering her not a virgin? This is something that we understand a lot better here in modern times. It's a power imbalance, right? He's older, he's more established, he lives in a patriarchal, male-oriented society. He's not on the same sort of, power and influence level as she is. And particularly in the case of somebody so young, putting aside right now that in modern times this would be a case of statutory rape, that law didn't exist then, but nonetheless, the Torah and then the sages elaborated on it, the seducer pays. Now he's going to pay for the humiliation and the degradation that he caused her, that her reputation suffered, right? That she suffers publicly because she participated in this. But because he confessed, he's not liable to the fine. Just that aspect of it is taken out of what he has to pay. Similarly, and now we're getting away from this law of marital relations, sex, men, women, etc. Similarly, one who says, I stole, pays the principal, the value of the stolen goods, based on his own confession, but he does not pay the double payment and the payment 4 and 5 times the principal for one who steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it, right? So when you're talking about somebody who stole becomes liable to not only replace what he stole, but to pay double the value. Or if he stole an ox and then he slaughtered it so that it cannot be returned, he actually owes the owner 4 times the value if it was a sheep, or 5 times the value if it was an ox, which is actually a huge amount of money. An ox was a very expensive item. But that multiplying of the actual out-of-pocket loss of the owner, what was stolen, the multiplying of that amount, that's the fine. As opposed to replacing what was lost, that's damages, right? So again, we're distinguishing between a fine and damages. So the one who admits that he stole, he pays the principal, he pays back what he stole, but he doesn't pay the fine or the double payment or the quadruple or quintuple payment. Likewise, if one confessed, my ox killed such and such a person, or my ox killed an ox belonging to such and such a person, the owner pays on his own admission, right, what he replaced, what he has to pay. However, if he said, my ox killed a slave belonging to so-and-so, he does not pay based on his own admission, not because the slave is worth less than a non-slave or the slave is worth less than an animal. There's never a comparison between a human and an animal, but rather because the Torah dictates, specifies elsewhere that when your ox kills a slave, you pay a specific amount, 30 sela, right? 30 sela, which I guess would be like 120 silver dinar. But the point is, because that amount is always the same, whether the slave was an adult or a child, whether the slave was a diamond cutter or a tailor, which is a much lower skill job, the money is always the same. Because the money is always the same and does not reflect the out-of-pocket cost of the owner of the slave, it's clear that that amount of money is a fine. And one who admits without being, persecuted, as it were, or prosecuted, brought to court by witnesses, if he admits it freely himself, he's the one that brings it to the attention of the court. He's excused, he pays damages, but he's excused from paying a fine. And since the value of, the money that the Torah dictates in the specific situation, your ox killed somebody else's slave, is always the same amount of money, that indicates that it's a fine and not damages. And that's why he's excused from paying it. This is the principle, says our Mishna. Anyone who pays more than what he damaged, The payments are fines, and therefore he does not pay if it's based on his own admission. He pays only based on the testimony of others. A fine is only levied against a person when he's brought to court based on other people's testimony. If he himself comes to court and admits this, he pays damages, but not the fine. That's Mishnah number 8. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, and let the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah, teach this law with regard to one who said, I raped the daughter of so-and-so. All through this chapter, we've been comparing the rapist to the seducer. Why does this Mishnah open with the one who admits to seduction? What about the one who admits to rape? Why did the Mishnah cite the case of seduction? And the Gemara answers, the Tana is speaking, employing the style of, it is not necessary. Meaning, it is, now that you've said that the rapist doesn't pay the fine, it is not necessary for the Mishnah to cite the case of one who says, I raped her, where he does not tarnish her reputation and merely incriminates himself, as it is obvious that he pays compensation for humiliation and degradation based on his own admission. However, in the case of one who says, I seduced her, where he tarnishes her reputation, right? Very interesting. Like a woman who was raped, her reputation doesn't suffer. It was no fault of hers. But a woman who participated in a seduction, her reputation is diminished. That's very real world, right? We would think it should not be so, but particularly in the ancient world, it was so. However, in the case of one who says, I seduced her, where he tarnishes her reputation, as he testifies that she willingly engaged in relations with him, and he is not deemed credible to say so. Say that he does not pay based on his own admission. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that even in the case of seduction, he pays compensation for humiliation and degradation based on his own admission, even though he doesn't pay the fine. Right? Now, that's very interesting. One who comes and says, I feel guilty, I seduced that young woman, I admit what I did, and I'm ready to pay the fine, the damages for humiliation and degradation. I understand I might be excused from paying the fine, but I'm ready to pay the damages for humiliation and degradation. So that you might think, well, this poor girl suffered humiliation and degradation. Here's the guy, he's admitting that he did it. Great, we've established that he seduced her and he pays the damages. Not so fast. Not so fast. The fact that a woman was seduced and that she engaged in premarital relations, it's a big avera, a big transgression, and it severely damages her reputation in the community, especially in ancient times, right? Particularly in ancient times. So are we going to establish that this woman had premarital relations and that her reputation, should suffer according to the culture as it was then? Based on the testimony of one witness. There's only one witness to this. So actually, the guy who comes and says, I seduced her, we don't believe him. We don't believe him. We don't want him to come and say that about her. The Gemara comments, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of this Tana, of a Baraisa, as it is taught. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, even the payments of humiliation and degradation he does not pay, based on his own admission, as it is not within his power to tarnish the reputation of the daughter of so-and-so based merely on his confession. Consequently, unless his account is corroborated by the testimony of others, his admission that she was complicit in her seduction is rejected. We would rather she not receive the damages for humiliation and degradation because she shouldn't be humiliated or degraded based on the testimony of one person, even if it's the seducer himself. Rav Papa said to Abaye, according to Rabbi Shimon, if she herself is amenable to his claim, right? If they both come together and he says, I seduced her, and she says, yeah, he seduced me. Okay, well then in that case, presumably the fine is off the table because he came of his own admission. He wasn't brought to the courthouse by somebody else. He came first, but she's amenable. She corroborates, yes, he did seduce me. So then at that point you would think, okay, now he pays the damages for humiliation and degradation. So when she is amenable, what is the law? Is he exempt from paying from the payments of humiliation and degradation in that case as well? And Abaye responded, yes, he's exempt because perhaps her father is not amenable to his daughter's reputation being tarnished. We therefore do not rely on his statement even in this case. Right? She can't be a witness, by the way, because you can't be a witness against yourself. Now you would think, well, the seducer's acting as a witness against himself, but he's the one who came to court, right? She didn't come with him. She was brought. And then she says, well, yeah, it's true. She might be amenable to that, but no, we don't rely on that because maybe her father is not amenable to her reputation being tarnished in this way. So we therefore do not rely on his statement, even in this case where the girl is amenable. So Rav Papa continued, well, if her father is also amenable to his claim, what is the law? Abaye responded, well, perhaps her other family members are not amenable, as the reputation of the entire family would be tarnished. Rav Papa asked, if the family members too are amenable, what then is the law? And Abaye answered, even if all the local relatives are amenable that this man admits he seduced her and that he wants to pay the damages, we don't accept it because it is impossible that there will not be at least one relative in a country overseas who is not amenable to his claim, who does not want the reputation of the family damaged by this act that happened between the seducer and this young woman. And therefore, since it originally started with this guy coming and saying, I seduced, we don't accept it, right? We'd rather she doesn't receive this money so that her reputation remains intact. So the Mishnah continues. And that's where they leave off that discussion of the seducer. Do we accept that do we accept his damages or not? Right? What is the law? One who says I seduced, one who confesses I seduced or I raped so-and-so's daughter is exempt from payment of the fine, but is obligated to pay compensation for humiliation and degradation. But it seems like, well, we're not going to take that from him. It must be that, well, he came first, but then other witnesses came forward and established that, yes, it's true. Okay, so he pays the damages, but he doesn't pay the fine because he came first. The Mishnah continues. One who says, I stole. He pays the principal, but he does not pay the double payment or the payment of 4 and 5 times the principal in the case of one who steals a sheep or an ox and slaughters it. It is stated that the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, disagreed with regard to the payment of half the damage that the owner of an innocuous ox, which was not yet witnessed goring a person or an ox 3 times, must pay to the owner of the ox that he gored. So Rav Papa said half the damage is considered a payment of money, compensation for the damage caused. And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said that half the damage is considered payment of a fine. So what are we talking? If a person owns an ox and the ox gets away from his, right, it's not called a shepherd. What is it called? A cattle herd? I'm being an idiot right now. I just can't remember the word. I'm sure it'll show up in the comments. One who tends to ox. I mean, other than a cowboy. What's he called? At any rate, it got away from the enclosure or it got away from his person who's watching his oxen, and it hurt either another ox or another person. Now, the Torah makes a big distinction between the habitual gorer and the new gorer, as it will. In other words, if this ox had escaped before, once, twice, 3 times, and caused damage, well, then the owner is forewarned. And then if his ox herd, cow herd, cattle herd, or more common in modern English, a drover. Thank you, Bill. I knew I could rely on you. So if your ox has done damage a few times, okay, now the owner is forewarned, and he has to take very special precautions to make sure that doesn't happen again with his ox, or maybe he should just slaughter it and sell the meat because his ox is dangerous. Now, if his ox gets out using the normal precautions that anyone would use, those precautions obviously weren't enough, and the owner is negligent, and he's going to have to pay much bigger damages if his ox does harm. But the first time that happens, if he's taking normal precautions that any owner of oxen would take, that his drover or his cow herd is doing what's normal, what anyone would agree is proper, normal safety precautions, and it gets out, well, this is an unforeseeable accident, and so then his liability is much lower. So in the case of your ox who gets away, and it's the first time this is happening, and he kills somebody else's ox, so you pay half the damage in that situation. Or if it kills a person, so you don't pay money for that. If it kills a slave, as we've seen, there's a fine for killing somebody else's slave. If you just kill a regular person, you're not going to pay money for that because it was an accident. It was simply an unforeseeable accident. But if it's the habitual gorer, then we're in another realm, right? Now, so you might say, well, okay, so if your ox gets away and kills somebody else's ox, and the Torah says that in that situation you pay half the damage. Okay, well, that sounds like damages, not a fine. But what the sages are going to argue about is, well, since you're not paying the damage, you're paying half the damage, it sounds like what you're paying is a fine. It's a money that's not the same. It's tied to, but it's not the same as the amount of the out-of-pocket loss of the owner of the ox that was killed. So are we going to characterize this as money damages, or are we going to characterize this as a fine? If it's a fine, and the owner of the ox that kills comes first and says, I admit my ox killed, then he doesn't have to pay a fine. So if that money is a fine, he's done. He doesn't have to pay anything. If the Torah says you're paying damages, and even though it's half damages because it's accidental, then he owes that money, right? In the case where he came and admitted it himself, rather than witnesses coming forward and accusing him that it was his ox that did this. Okay, so we have a disagreement on when your ox kills somebody else's ox, and it's not a habitual gorer, and the Torah says you pay half the value of the ox that was killed. Is that money damages, or is that a fine, right? Rav Papa says the half damage is money. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says the half damage is a fine. So the Gemara elaborates. Rav Papa said, it's getting super hot in here, so I'm going to turn on the AC. Let me know, when I turn on the AC, does that get in the way of the sound? I actually don't know the answer to that, so just let me know that in the comments. Okay, so the Gemara, the Gemara elaborates. Rav Papa said half the damage is considered a payment of money because he maintains standard oxen do not exist in the presumptive state of safety, and therefore they are likely to cause damage. Anyone who owns oxen is running the risk that one of his oxen might get away and might kill somebody else's ox, and he should be ready to pay half the value of the ox that is killed. And by right, the owner should pay the entire damage caused by his animal, because it's predictable that an ox might get away and kill somebody else's ox. So he should pay the whole value. And it is the merciful one, God, that has compassion on him and stipulates in his Torah that since this ox is not yet forewarned, is not a habitual gorer, until it has gored a person or an animal 3 times, you only pay half the damage. And so the merciful one is saying, okay, since you weren't forewarned that this particular ox is dangerous, but you should realize that any owner of oxen is undertaking some risk, so you only pay half the damage. Therefore, we're talking about damages. You only pay half of it, but it's damages. What's the other viewpoint? Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said that half the damage is payment of a fine, as he maintains standard oxen exist in the presumptive state of safety. The normal ox is not dangerous, and by right, the owner should not have to pay at all, as the ox goring could not have been anticipated. It's just an accident. He didn't do anything wrong, and it is the merciful one that penalized him, that he has to pay half the damage, so that he should take extra precaution and guard his oxen. You know, in other words, the normal presumption is oxen don't go around goring other oxen, but because it could happen, you should have some extra precautions, and that's why God stipulates in the Torah that in the case of the non-habitual goring ox, you pay half the damage. No sound difference, just a little background noise doesn't affect the audio. Thank you. Thank you. now I will be running my AC more often because it really helps me out in here. That is great. Okay. And I can even run the fan a little slower. Great. Okay. Where am I? Okay. So the Gemara provides a mnemonic for the proofs cited with regard to this dispute. Is the half damage of the non-habitual goring ox who did kill an ox money damages or a fine? And so the mnemonic is the sequence of words. Damaged, what? Killed, principle. And the Gemara will explain. We learned in a Mishnah that if an innocuous ox gored and killed another person's ox, both the damaged and the damager share in the payments, because you only pay half the value of the damage. So granted, according to the one who said that half the damage is a payment of money, well, that is how the damaged party shares in the payments. By right, the owner of the dead ox should be compensated for his entire loss. However, since the ox that gored his ox was innocuous, the owner of the gored ox bears half the cost. The Mishnah characterizes him as sharing in the payment, right? Because it was an accident, not foreseeable. He shares in the loss. He only gets half the value of what he lost. And the one who owns the ox pays half the value. It was not foreseeable. It was an accident, but after all, it was his ox, so he shares in half the damage. However, according to the one who said that the half damage payment is a fine, so by right, the injured party himself, it would be entitled to nothing. In this case, where the one who confessed came forward first. So if it's a fine, he should be entitled to nothing. Now the owner takes half the damage that by right is not his. Can he be characterized as sharing in the payments? So the Gemara answers, the law is necessary only for the degradation of the carcass. This is another category of damages. Initially, half the damage is assessed by calculating the difference between the value of a living ox and the value of its carcass when the owner of the ox that gored the other ox stands trial. The degradation in the value of the carcass from when it was gored and became a carcass until the owner is able to sell it is borne by the owner of the carcass, right? I own an ox. Today I have an ox. It's worth 200 dinar. My life is good. My neighbor's ox comes over and kills my ox. Okay, my dead ox as a carcass, not a slaughtered ox, right? Just a carcass. So it's not kosher meat because it was killed without being slaughtered. So in this state, it's worth, let's say, 100 dinar. I want to sell it to somebody who can use the hide, the meat. Non-Jews can eat the meat, just Jews can't eat the meat. So if I can find a non-Jewish butcher, I could sell it to him. I could sell the carcass to him. But if I can't sell it on the day it was gored, when it's fresh, maybe it takes a few weeks to sell it. Oh, so now the meat's getting a little old and it's dropping in value. So by the time I can actually sell it, maybe it's only worth 80 dinar instead of 100. Who bears that loss of 20? Me, the owner of the carcass, or the one whose ox killed my ox? That's what they're discussing. Initially, half the damage is assessed by calculating the difference between the value of a living ox and the value of its carcass when the owner of the ox that gored the other ox stands trial. So the degradation in value of the carcass from when it was gored until the owner is able to sell it is borne by the owner of the carcass. The owner thereby shares in the payment as he loses that sum. So the Gemara asks, we already learned the law with regard to the degradation of the carcass in a Baraisa in Tractate Bava Kama, page 10b, in which it is taught that the passage in the Mishnah, I have become liable to pay payments of damage, teaches that the owners tend to the carcass and therefore they bear the costs of its degradation. It's still in his possession. So the Gemara answers, one of these laws is with regard to an innocuous ox, and the other law is with regard to a forewarned ox, the habitual gore, the one that it's predictable that it will cause harm. So the Gemara adds, and it is necessary to teach both laws, as if the Mishnah had taught us only with regard to an innocuous ox. One would understand that its owner is treated with leniency, because it was not foreseeable that his ox would kill another ox. And the owner of the carcass bears the cost of degradation due to the fact that the killing ox has not yet been forewarned. However, with regard to a forewarned ox, meaning the owner was forewarned that his ox is a habitual gorer, say no. The owner of the carcass should not bear the cost of degradation. And if the Mishnah had taught us only with regard to the forewarned ox, one would understand that its owner is treated with leniency, and the owner of the carcass bears the cost of degradation. Why? Due to the fact that the owner of the forewarned ox pays the entire damage, not just half the damage. And therefore, the relatively insignificant cost of degradation is overlooked. However, with regard to an innocuous ox, say no. Since the owner pays only half the damage, he should bear the cost of degradation. Therefore, it was necessary to state the law in both cases, and therefore, there is no proof from this Mishnah whether the half damage is payment of money or payment of a fine. We've established that the owner of the carcass bears the loss of degradation, not the owner of the ox that killed, but we haven't established whether the half damage payment in the case of the innocuous ox is a fine or a money payment of damages. Relevant to our issue, where the owner of the ox who killed comes forward and says, my ox killed, without him being brought to court by witnesses. So the Gemara continues. Come and hear an additional proof from a Baraisa. What is the difference between an innocuous and a forewarned ox? The difference is that the owner of an innocuous ox pays half the damage from its body. Compensation for the damage may be collected only from the body of the ox that gored another ox. So you get this, you can collect half the damage. From where do you collect it? Maybe the owner of the ox that gored doesn't have money lying around to pay half the value of a dead ox. So where are you going to get it from? Only from the value of the ox itself that did the goring. Well, that animal is still alive. So what are you talking about? Well, now that owner might have to slaughter it and sell it, or he might just have to sell that ox. But wherever you're going to get this money, it's only going to come from the body of the ox that did the goring. In the case of the innocuous ox. In the case of the forewarned ox, the habitual gorer, now that the owner of that habitual gorer owes the full value of the ox that was gored and died, from where can you collect that sum? From the choicest property of the owner of the habitual gorer. Why is this really relevant? We've been imagining sort of like that the goring ox and the victim ox are kind of similar oxen. But it could be that the one who was killed is a super high quality Kobe beef ox. And the ox that did the goring is a skinny, old, much lower value ox. So if the innocuous ox that did the goring is worth much less money than the victim ox, well, but that's the only place where he can collect from is the body of the gorer, because it was an innocuous gorer. But if it was a forewarned ox that did the goring, then it doesn't matter whether the one that did the goring is a lower value animal. You can get the full value of your Kobe beef ox from other property, even the choicest property of the owner of the habitual gorer. The Tana of this Baraisa did not teach an additional difference that the owner, now the Tana left something out, and this is what we're learning from whether the half damage is a fine or money damages. The Tana of this teaching did not teach an additional difference that the owner of an innocuous ox does not pay based on his own admission, and the owner of a forewarned ox pays on his own admission. Apparently, the half damage is therefore payment of money and not a fine. Gemara refutes this argument. This Baraisa is no proof that the payment of half damage in the case of an innocuous ox that kills is a fine or is money damages. Why? This Baraisa is no proof, as the Tana taught some cases and omitted others. He did not list all the differences between an innocuous and a forewarned ox. The Gemara asks, well, what else did he omit? That he omitted this. If he's saying he only taught certain rules of the differences between an innocuous ox and a forewarned ox, well, what else did he leave out? The failure to include an item in a list can be deemed insignificant only if it is one of at least two omissions. If it is the only omission, you can't say that he left it, that it's simply an incomplete list. It must be that he left it out to teach something. So if there's only one omission, apparently it was omitted on purpose, advisedly. The Gemara replies, he omitted the law of the half ransom as well. If a forewarned ox killed a person, its owner pays a ransom. And if an innocuous ox killed a person, the owner does not pay even half the ransom. Right? A forewarned ox, right, killed somebody. That your big negligence resulted in a death. Yeah, you're going to pay big money, right, for the loss of a human being. But if it was an innocuous ox, it's just a terrible tragedy, a terrible accident, and the owner doesn't pay. But the Gemara rejects this claim. If it is due to the half ransom that the failure to list the difference with regard to payment based on one's own admission is insignificant, that is not an omission. Now we're on 41b, as it can be explained like this. According to whose opinion is this Baraisa taught? It is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who said, the owner of an innocuous ox pays half the ransom. According to his opinion, the only differences between innocuous and forewarned oxen are those specified in the Mishnah. The Gemara suggests, come and hear an additional proof from the Mishnah. One who said, my ox killed so-and-so, or my ox killed an ox belonging to so-and-so, this owner pays on his own admission. Now what, is this not referring to an innocuous ox for which he pays half the damage, proving that it is a payment of money and not a fine? And the Gemara rejects this proof. No, the Tana is referring to a forewarned animal. The Gemara asks, well, however, in the case of an innocuous ox, what is the law? If it is that he does not pay based on his own admission, because it's a fine, then rather than teaching the latter clause of the Mishnah, one whose ox killed a slave belonging to so-and-so does not pay based on his own admission, because that definitely is a fine. So let him distinguish and teach the distinction within the case itself. In what case is this statement said? It is with regard to a forewarned ox. However, the owner of an innocuous ox does not pay based on his own admission. The Gemara rejects this proof. The entire Mishnah is speaking of a forewarned ox and does not address the law of an innocuous ox at all. That Mishnah over there. Therefore, no proof can be cited with regard to the nature of the half payment in the case of the innocuous ox who killed another ox. We're still trying to establish the half damage payment. When one ox, which is an innocuous ox, kills another ox, and the Torah says you pay half the damage, is that damages or is that a fine? Because the one who admits it himself without being brought to court to do so, he is excused from paying fines, but he does pay damages. So is this half payment damages or a fine? The Gemara suggests, come and hear an additional proof from this principle, from our Mishnah. This is the principle, right? It says in our Mishnah, Mishnah number 8, here at the end of chapter 3. Anyone who pays more than what he damaged, the payments are fines. And therefore, he does not pay based on his own admission. And the Gemara infers, well, if he pays less than what he damaged, he pays based on his own admission. It must be damages. If he's paying less than the amount of what was lost, it must be money damages and not a fine. So if he admits it, he pays it because it's damages and not a fine. But the Gemara rejects this proof. Do not infer and say, if he pays less than what he damages, he pays based on his own admission. Rather, you should infer and say, if he pays precisely what he damaged, he pays based on his own admission. But if the Torah stipulates that he pays more or less than the actual out-of-pocket cost of the owner of the ox that was killed, then we're in the world of fines and not damages, and one who is going to pay based on his own admission is excused from paying fines. The Gemara asks, but according to that explanation, if he pays less than the damage that he caused, what is the law? If it is that he does not pay based on his own admission, so let the Tana teach a more general principle. This is the principle. Anyone who does not pay the amount that he damaged does not pay based on his own admission, because if he's not asked to pay the amount that he damaged, whether it's more or less, it must be a fine, and he does not pay. But that is not what the Tana of our Mishnah said. The Tana in our Mishnah said if he pays more than what he damaged, that's a fine and he's excused. So the case where he's asked to pay less than what he damaged must be that that is not a fine, that it is damages, and even based on his own admission, he pays. So the Gemara concludes, yes, this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, that payment of half the damage is a fine. No, it's damages, and even the one who comes of his own admission pays it. And the Gemara further concludes, and the law is that payment of half the damage is a fine. We just went through and said, we refuted that opinion, but the law is, no, payment of half damage is a fine. Is there a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua? And the law is in accordance with his opinion? What are you saying? Asked the Gemara. And the Gemara responds, yes, the law is in accordance with his opinion. As what is the reason that his opinion was conclusively refuted? It is because the Tana does not teach this is the principle, anyone who does not pay the amount that he damaged. However, the reason the Tana did not employ that formulation is not clear cut for him, since there is the payment of half the damage caused by pebbles dispersed by an animal proceeding in its usual manner, as it is a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai that the payment for pebbles is a monetary payment, not a fine. Right? If you're walking your oxen through the street and your oxen kicks a pebble, and the pebble, sort of is launched, and there's let's say a merchant on the side of the road selling glassware, and this pebble kicked by your ox breaks the glass, you're going to owe damages for this kind of direct but indirect damage that your ox caused. It's as if your ox trampled the glass. Kicking the pebbles is the same as trampling the glass. And that Moses was told at Mount Sinai, a tradition that goes all the way back to one of those original laws at the core of the oral tradition. Many of the laws in the Talmud, the oral tradition, were sort of derived by the sages from the written Torah, but some were originally given by God to Moses to sort of kick off the oral tradition, and that was one of them. Right? And you pay, in that case, you pay half the damage. When your ox kicks a pebble and it breaks the glass on the side of the road, you're liable for half the damage because it was kind of accidental, but kind of foreseeable. And when you pay that half damage, it is considered damages, not a fine. Therefore, the half damage of the innocuous ox goring another ox is akin to the pebble that broke the glass, and therefore the half damage payment is considered damages and not a fine. And the one who admits that his ox killed somebody else's ox without being brought to court, he still pays the half damage because it's damages and not a fine. Am I overly repetitive? Like I want to keep things really clear, and so I kind of keep stating the gist of it so that we can keep it clear. I find that useful for me in my learning. Let me know if I'm being overly repetitive. Based on that ruling, the Gemara concludes, and now that you said that payment of half the damage is a fine, this dog that ate lambs and a cat that ate large roosters is unusual damage, for which the owner is liable to pay only half the damage if the animal was innocuous. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. That the payment is a monetary payment and not a fine. Okay, yeah, I got it right. So based on that ruling, the Gemara concludes, and now that you said that payment of half the damage is a fine, this dog that ate lambs and a cat that ate large roosters, this is unusual damage for which the owner is liable to pay only half the damage if the animal was innocuous. And therefore, we do not collect it at all in Babylonia because the payment for unusual damage is a fine, and fines cannot be collected in Babylonia as there are no ordained judges authorized to adjudicate cases involving fines. However, if the cat ate small roosters, well, that is its usual manner, and we collect the damages in Babylonia because this is payment of money and not a fine. It's damages and not a fine. And the Gemara comments, and in cases of fines, if the injured party seized property from the offender in the amount of the fine, Even in Babylonia, we do not repossess it from him, as according to the letter of the law, he is entitled to that payment. And the party from whom he seized the property cannot claim that he does not owe that payment. And if the injured party said, set me a time to go to a court in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, where they do have ordained judges who can evaluate whether a fine needs to be paid or not, as opposed to in Babylonia. So then we set a time for him. And if the disputant does not go to Israel as demanded, we excommunicate him. There's a whole bunch of laws being tossed in here at the end. But here it's just not for heavy analysis. We'll get back to these ideas in other tractates. The Gemara adds, and we're almost done here with chapter 3 and with our discussion of Mishnah number 8. I'm in the last paragraph, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara adds, either way, whether or not he agrees to go to Eretz Yisrael, if he keeps the cause of the damage, we in Babylonia excommunicate him, as we say to him, remove your cause of damage, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Nassan says, from where is it derived that a person may not raise a vicious dog in his house and may not place an unsteady ladder in his house? It is as is stated, and you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you shall not place blood in your house. It is prohibited to leave a potentially dangerous object in one's house, and one who refuses to remove it is excommunicated. And that concludes chapter 3. So let's just review for a second. This Mishnah, our final Mishnah that we've been discussing, related to the rest of the chapter in that the seducer who admits he seduced, or the thief who admits he stole, is still liable for damages to replace what was lost, or humiliation and degradation in the case of the woman who was seduced, but he's not liable to pay the fine, which is on top of damages, because he admitted it himself. And that's good policy, right? To encourage people who transgress to come of their own free will without being prompted or demanded to, that they admit it, and so they get excused from the fine and they just have to replace what was lost. Appertaining to that discussion, we started talking about the ox that gores and the foreseeability of, do you own an animal that is a hazard to other animals and people? And we're going to treat the one who owns an ox that is foreseeably dangerous, we're going to treat his owner different than the owner of an ox that is not foreseeably dangerous. And toward the end of that discussion, we learned the very general, very applicable, very modern principle that if you have a hazard on your property, even though it's on your property, you are liable for harm that it causes. You might say, well, wait a minute. If somebody trespasses on my property, he didn't belong there anyway. So the fact that I keep a vicious dog there, is my dog, and let's say my vicious guard dog kills the trespasser. Was the trespasser a burglar coming to do me harm? Maybe it was just a kid taking a shortcut on the way to school, right? There's a lot of nuance to those laws. But the general principle comes from a verse in the Torah that says, you shall have a guardrail around your roof. You have to have a parapet on your roof. You can't have a roof that people can walk up there and, in the dark, just stumble off your roof and get hurt. You have a spiritual, moral obligation to avoid causing foreseeable harm to not only your family, but also your neighbors and society at large. All right, let's go to questions and comments. On page 41. Sharon, if the seducer confessed to the father, I would agree to this principle. But if this is a public confession, isn't that itself the cause of the humiliation? That person should not be given a break at all. You rule exactly like the sages who say, we don't accept this confession of the guy who seduced a woman. I must say, thank God I could say I was not like this. Maybe when I was very young and I, repent. But there are a lot of guys out there who, like they brag about their conquests, right? And who they've been with. First of all, that's terrible lashon hara. It's a terrible thing to talk about. You know, and you know, a guy who goes around, you know, sort of like building himself up like he's been with a lot of women, regardless of the harm that he's causing those women. Yeah, this is a guy who we should deem not trustworthy, right? That's not somebody you want to do business with. That's not somebody you want to, you know, accept other kinds of testimony and truths from him. It's a very harmful person, and the sages felt that way, and Sharon agrees. Joseph A.G. You mentioned a few nights ago in passing that the sages determine that a certain proof text as more so non-literal. When and how do they figure out how to come to the conclusion that we do not take the Torah at face value in some cases? I think we're talking about an eye for an eye, right? That they determine that an eye for an eye does not mean an eye for an eye. An eye for an eye means if you did a harmful action that was not an accident and it put out somebody's eye, that the damages you owe for that are going to be paid in money, not by the loss of your own eye. They derived that law through exhaustive analysis, a little bit that we saw here in Tractate Kesubos, but that we'll see much greater length. I forget offhand which tractate that's in, but you know, the idea that a verse in the Torah is not to be taken literally is actually a very dangerous concept, and not one that we jump to. The sages themselves, who were much closer in time to the revelation at Sinai, who were much better versed in the meaning and implication and, you know, underlying truth of Torah verses, they would be very, very cautious to ever say something is taken non-literally, and that is not for us to say, right? We rely on traditions to say that a particular verse is not to be taken literally, and that's actually a very interesting position. It's not about biblical literalism, as that is often discussed in the culture, which is a discussion for another day. What I'm simply saying here is, you know, every verse in the Torah is understood by our sages to have, it has infinite meanings. But, you know, the sort of general categories of meanings sort of exist at 4 levels. That's called Pardes, right? It's an acronym from paradise, the Garden of Eden, Pardes, paradise, which literally means the orchard. But every verse, we understand it to have Pei, Resh, Dalid, and I guess is it Samek or Shin? It's Samek, I think. But at any rate, the Peshat, right, the simple literal meaning has to work. The Remez, the hint of something deeper going on. The Derosh, right, the deeper meaning that you extract through a lot of study and checking out the sources, you know, and takes some real Torah, you know, experience. And the Sod, the secret, right? The secret, meaning the deep mystical meanings. And so every verse works at those 4 levels. But that top level is the Peshat, the simple literal meaning. And if you ever feel that you want to remove a verse from its simple literal meaning, you got to have some very, very strong evidence for doing that. And I don't mean personal logic, right? Strong evidence in the tradition. Sharon, so please clarify for this tired person, how does the damaging oxen determination give us insight into the seducing person? And this was really about just that aspect of it. Did he admit it himself or not, right? If my ox killed somebody else, did that guy go to court, killed somebody else's ox? Did that guy go to court and say, hey, Sal's ox killed my ox, I'm entitled to half the damages? For sure I owe it. But if I run to the court and I say my ox killed, my neighbor's ox, do I have to pay, and it was an innocuous ox, do I have to pay the half damage or not? Answer, yes, I do, because that payment is considered damages and not a fine, even at the end of that exhaustive analysis. So then Sharon asks, well, so if a man is a chronic seducer, is he treated differently? That's a great question. I don't know if there, the idea of the chronic gorer, the habitual goring ox versus the innocuous ox, that's a distinction that the Torah makes. I don't know that the Torah makes a distinction called the chronic seducer. Maybe the sages do, but I don't know. We haven't seen that yet. It seems like there should be. Bill, if I have followed correctly, the damaging oxen determination is used to determine the difference between a fine and payment of damages. Well, here we're talking about the one who admits it himself. That's where there's a distinction between the fine and damages. There's also, implications of there's also fine versus damages as part of the conversation about the habitual gorer versus the innocuous ox. But that determination is also, there's another distinction, a big distinction. The habitual gorer pays the full damage, and you can take the amount of that money from any property of the owner of the habitual gorer versus the owner of the innocuous ox. The money can only come from the innocuous ox itself, and it's only a half damage payment, which is a different analysis than did the owner come forward himself, in which case he's not liable to pay a fine, but he is liable to pay damages. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, for a new chapter, chapter 4, here in Tractate Kesubos. Have a great